Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Keep It Real. So, I just got back from a trip to Minneapolis where I was one of 10 speakers who were invited to speak at a medical conference on inflammation. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about my topic. I spoke for an hour, so I'm just going to kind of condense it and just keep to kind of the key points. But I thought I'd mention a couple things about what I discussed in my presentation at this conference. So the thing that I talked about was how bacterial toxins and other things could break down the integrity of the gut barrier. And once that barrier system is broken down, then things are allowed to get through that barrier system that otherwise would not. And when that happens, they can induce inflammation all over the body. So the gastrointestinal tract is kind of a long tube that goes from your mouth all the way through your gastrointestinal tract. And so if we just take a part of the gastrointestinal tract, let's just say just part of the wall here, and we blow it up, it looks like this. It has these kind of finger projections on top, and this is where things are absorbed. This is where your nutrients get broken down, and this is what really increases the surface area of your gastrointestinal tract. So it's only one cell layer thick. In other words, it's not a whole column of cells. It's only one cell layer thick, but it's bound together by these really strong proteins that tie all these epithelial cells together, and they create this nice tight junction so that things traveling through the gastrointestinal tract just get absorbed that are supposed to get absorbed. So things travel through the gastrointestinal tract, and they're supposed to be broken down by these enzymes that hang out in these brush border area, and then they get absorbed, and then down below here we have our circulation. So we'll use that in red. So this is where like your red blood cells are in here. And so eventually this is how your nutrients, amino acids, and your vitamins and minerals, they get absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract and they get into your circulation, and then they could travel all throughout your body. And this is how we absorb nutrients. We get nutrients to our brain and to our skin and to all of our vital organs. But there's some things that can go wrong, unfortunately, with this. And if we have too much bacteria in the gut, remember your gut has about 5 to 7 pounds of bacteria in it. And that's normal and healthy. But for a variety of reasons, there can be an imbalance in the bacteria of the gut. When there's an imbalance, we call that dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is an imbalance of the good and bad bacteria. So what happens in dysbiosis is oftentimes gram-negative bacteria builds up. You've heard of gram-negative bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. And when these gram-negative bacteria build up in the gastrointestinal tract in here, they have a toxin in them. And the toxin, one of them is called lipopolysaccharides, we'll say LPS. The other one has a longer name. It's called cytolethal distending toxin. So cytolethal distending toxin. XIN. Cytolethal distending toxin. And so that's only necessary to know from just an academic standpoint. But basically, these two toxins, lipopolysaccharides and cytolethal distending toxins, once that builds up in the gut because of dysbiosis, then that breaks down the integrity of the gut barrier. And now we have a big hole in our gut barrier. Sometimes we call that leaky gut. Once the gut becomes leaky, then things that are not supposed to cross through here are now allowed to cross, and that can cause inflammation all over the body. So this is one of the things that I talked about in my presentation, is that we have to take care of the bacteria in our gut, because I mentioned before in past episodes that, remember, there's like a 10-to-1 ratio of bacterial cells to human cells. For every human cells all over our body, there's 10 bacterial cells. And from a genetic standpoint, we have about 20 to 25,000 human genes. At any given time, we harbor between 2 million and 20 million microbial genes. So by any way you measure it, we're vastly outnumbered by our bacterial counterparts. And so it's really important that we understand what kind of things influence our good and bad bacteria so that we can maintain integrity of our gut barrier and things don't cross into that gut barrier that aren't supposed to. What are some other things that break down the integrity of the gut barrier? One of them is gluten from wheat and from rye and from barley. So if you are suspecting that you might have some compromise to your gut barrier, or somebody has told you that you have leaky gut, then gluten would probably not be a good thing for you to consume, because we know that gluten can break down the integrity of the gut barrier. And we know that alcohol could break down the gut barrier. Certainly alcoholism, we know for sure, causes chronic breakdown of the gut barrier. But even a short-term, in the studies they call it binge drinking. A binge drinking session is only 4 drinks. So 4 drinks can cause breakdown of the gut barrier. And so you go, oh, just college students binge drink. I don't binge drink. But if you think about it, I'm in San Diego and we love our Mexican restaurants here in San Diego. But some of these Mexican restaurants that you go to, you order a margarita and you get this huge margarita. It's basically served to you in a bowl with a stem, and you have to drink it like this. That's not just one drink. You probably have to count 2 or 3 of those. So if you have a couple margaritas, you're probably 4 to 6 drinks in as far as the alcohol content goes, and that'll really start to break down the integrity of that gut barrier. If you throw anything out, other things that we know on top of that, things like if you're having gluten with that, ibuprofen like Advil and Motrin, we know that breaks down the integrity of the gut barrier. We know stress can break down the integrity of the gut barrier. So bacterial toxins, alcohol, gluten, other foods can do it, stress. When there's a combination of these insults to the gastrointestinal tract, we can start to get into chronic breakdown of the gut barrier. And then people complain of knee pain or shoulder pain, and they just feel inflamed. Every morning when they step out of bed, everything is sore and the whole body hurts and it's inflamed. That can come from lack of integrity of this gut barrier or leaky gut. People who have chronic muscle tightness and contributing to headaches, people who have certain blood markers that are elevated, inflammation blood markers like CRP, C-reactive protein. Everybody should have that tested. If that's elevated, that can be coming from breakdown of your gut barrier. So this is something that needs to be understood, and we all have to take into account what kind of things could help and what kind of things can hurt our gastrointestinal tract. So if you have breakdown of the gut barrier, first of all, you have to stay away from the things that we know that irritate your gut barrier. That's kind of rule number 1. And some people have to do kind of a whole gut repair protocol. But at the very least, you want to support your bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract. So some people have to take probiotics. There's lots of other nutrients that we'll probably go into in future episodes, but things like L-glutamine, N-acetylglucosamine, things like fish oils, vitamin D, vitamin A, zinc. We already talked about probiotics. There's lots of different nutrients that help to repair the integrity of the gastrointestinal border. But the key thing is we have to balance these bacterial cytotoxins. And one thing from a dietary perspective is you got to make the right food choices. Certain food choices really help to promote good, healthy bacteria, and that's really plants. So one of my favorite authors, Michael Pollan, he says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's kind of his motto. And it's mostly plant material, vegetables, fruits, berries, these kind of things, greens. This is what really gives us the right amount of fiber and the right amount of micronutrients to really create the right environment in our gut to promote good, beneficial bacteria. So that's the take-home message from the lecture that I did. Hopefully you learned something there. And until then, we will talk to you next time. Keep it real.